The wind clawed across the plains like a starving animal, carrying dust that scraped against the skin and filled the lungs until every breath tasted of grit. The sky above was colorless, washed in that pale yellow light that came before a storm, though no rain had fallen in months. Through that wasteland staggered a woman. Her skirts were torn at the hem, the color beaten away by sun and dirt. Her hair, once dark and heavy, now hung in loose, wild strands. She clutched a bundle to her chest, her child, the only thing left that made her move one foot after the other. Evangeline Crow whispered to the baby, voice so hoarse it barely rose above the wind. Hush now, just a little more. The child whimpered, not with the hearty cry of life, but the weak, rasping whine of hunger and fever. Evangeline tightened her grip, afraid the wind might tear the little one from her arms. When she crested the ridge, she saw it, the small frontier town of Deadwood Creek. A scattering of wooden buildings huddled against the horizon, smoke curling from one or two chimneys. Salvation, or so she prayed. But when she reached the well in the center of town and fell to her knees, the faces that turned toward her were not salvation. They were suspicion, judgment, and pity warped into cruelty. She's Crow's woman, muttered one man, spitting tobacco into the dust. Her man run off weeks ago. Drunk, gambler, no good. Left her to rot. She don't belong here. Ain't decent. Children pointed, giggling at her torn dress. One mimicked the weak mule of her baby until his mother cuffed him on the ear, though she never stopped staring at Evangeline like she was filth. Evangeline pressed her cracked lips to the baby's damp forehead. Heat radiated from the child's skin. Fever. Her heart clawed in her chest. She turned desperate eyes toward the people. Please, she rasped. Water, for my boy. The sheriff himself was among them, Sheriff Billings, a broad man with a badge that caught the light like a blade. He looked at her, then looked away, as though her suffering was an inconvenience. We got our own mouths to feed, woman, he said, voice flat. Ain't our burden you came limpin' in. The crowd murmured agreement. Evangeline felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. She wanted to sink into the earth, vanish, never be seen again. Her child whimpered louder. She pressed her cheek to his, whispering words to him but perhaps also to the sky above, to anyone or anything that might listen. Don't touch me. I'm broken. The words tumbled out raw, a confession torn from a soul that had no pride left to guard. Broken, not just her body, starved and ragged, but her spirit, her trust, her hope. The townsfolk turned away one by one. She might as well have been invisible. And then he appeared. A tall figure stepped from the edge of the crowd, moving with the slow surety of a man who had spent more years in silence than in words. His hat brim shadowed his face, but the lines etched in his jaw spoke of years carved by sun and sorrow. Wyatt Calder, a rancher whose land stretched a few miles north, though it yielded less with every passing season. Folks said he was widowed, though he never spoke of it. He was a man who carried silence the way others carried weapons. He said nothing as he approached. Evangeline braced herself, expecting him to spit words like the others. Instead, he crouched beside her, his shadow falling over her and the baby. Slowly, with a gentleness that caught the breath in her throat, he reached for the bundle. Her arms flinched tighter. Don't. But Calder did not pull or press. He only waited, his eyes steady, blue-gray, like storm clouds over dry land. And after a moment, when her strength gave way, she let him take the child. The rancher cradled the infant with the care of a man who understood fragility. The baby whimpered once, then settled against his broad chest. Calder reached into his coat, drew out a battered canteen, and held it to Evangeline. Drink! The single word fell like mercy. Water trickled across her parched lips, tasting of iron and leather, but it might as well have been heaven. She drank, gasped, drank again until her body shook. Around them, the crowd muttered, "Fool rancher. Gonna drag trouble to his doorstep. She ain't worth savin'." Calder ignored them. He stood, the baby secure in his arms, and looked down at Evangeline. Without another word, he nodded for her to rise. She tried. Her legs buckled. Darkness tugged at the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw before she collapsed was the rancher's boots moving closer, dust swirling around him as steady as the tide. And the last sound she heard was her baby's faint sigh, safe in the arms of a man who spoke nothing, yet carried more kindness than all the town combined. Evangeline woke to the creak of a wooden shutter in the wind. For a moment, she thought she had dreamed the town, the stairs, the collapse. Then the smell of smoke from a low fire and the faint cry of her child pulled her back to waking. She was not in the dust of Deadwood Creek anymore. The room was small, plain, its walls built of pine planks scarred by years of weather. A single chair, a narrow bed beneath her, and a lantern glowing weak in the corner. On a peg near the door hung a man's coat, sun-faded and patched at the elbows. Everything smelled faintly of leather, sweat, and tobacco. Her heart thudded. Where was the baby? She pushed herself upright too fast, dizziness blurring her vision. Panic flooded her chest. Then she saw him. Wyatt Calder sat in a chair beside the hearth, her child in his arms. He rocked slowly, boots planted firm on the floor, his weathered face bent toward the infant. He wasn't singing, not exactly, but a low hum carried in his chest, the kind of sound cattlemen used to calm a skittish herd. The baby slept. Peaceful. Breathing steady. Relief broke something inside Evangeline. She pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from crying aloud. Calder looked up, meeting her eyes. He didn't speak, only shifted the child gently into her waiting arms. The silence stretched between them. It was not cruel like the silence of the townsfolk. This silence felt different, weighty, but patient. Finally, he said, "Kitchen's through there." He nodded toward a door. "There's bread." His voice was low, rough from dust and years of solitude. Evangeline clutched her child, uncertain if she should thank him or flee. But her body betrayed her, weak, starved, trembling. Bread was the only word that mattered. She carried the baby to the kitchen, a space as bare as the room she'd left. The loaf on the table was hard, the knife dull. Her hand shook so badly that when she cut a piece, it slipped and fell to the floor. She froze, waiting for the rebuke she had always known to follow. But Calder only picked up the bread, brushed it off, and set it back in her hand. His expression never shifted. "You'll need strength," he said simply. Her throat tightened. She ate in silence, her child dozing against her shoulder. The days that followed blurred together, marked by the rhythm of Calder's ranch. Morning came with the sound of boots on the porch, the door opening to let in the smell of horses and hay. Calder spoke little, but his actions filled the silence. He chopped wood, hauled water, worked the cattle that still survived the drought. Each evening, he came back with dust ground into his skin, his shirt damp with sweat, his movements slow with weariness. Evangeline tried to help. The first time she carried a pail of water, it slipped from her hands, spilling across the floor. She dropped to her knees, ashamed, expecting anger. But Calder only grabbed a rag, knelt beside her, and mopped the spill without a word. When she burned bread in the oven, the smoke filling the kitchen, she braced for his temper. But he waved the smoke away with one hand, chewed the blackened crust without complaint, and said, "Tastes fine." Each time, her confusion deepened. Men she had known had never been patient, never been gentle. But the whispers of town followed her even here. On her second trip into Deadwood Creek, to fetch salt and flour, she heard them. "That's Calder's charity case. Woman like her shouldn't be under his roof. Bet she's paying him back the only way she can." The words crawled into her ears like thorns. She hurried through the store, clutching her child so tightly he whimpered. When she returned to the ranch, she set the supplies down too hard, glass jar cracking against the table. Calder looked up from mending tack. "I won't stay," she blurted. "Not if folk think." His gaze held hers, steady, unreadable. Then he bent back to his work. "Let them talk," he said. "Words don't keep cattle fed." The dismissal stunned her. For the first time in years, no one demanded she defend herself. No one threw her shame in her face. One night, the baby's fever spiked. Evangeline's heart nearly stopped at the heat radiating from his tiny body. She dipped cloth in water, pressed it to his brow, whispered prayers into the dark. Panic gnawed her raw. She had lost everything else. She could not lose him. When she looked up, Calder was there. He reached out. She hesitated, then handed the child over, desperation stronger than pride. Calder rocked the baby, his massive hands astonishingly careful. He began to hum again, low and steady, the sound rumbling through his chest like thunder far off in the hills. The baby's cries softened, then eased. His breathing steadied. Evangeline watched from the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. Tears blurred her sight. The rancher's silhouette bent over her child looked carved from stone, but the motion of his arms was soft as dusk. Something inside her shifted. A thread of fear unwound, replaced with something she dared not name. When the fever broke by morning, the baby slept deep. Evangeline whispered, her voice breaking, "Why help me?" Calder looked at her a long while, then answered in 4 words that carried more weight than a sermon. "Because no one else would." The summer dragged on without mercy. Day after day, the sun climbed and scalded the land until even the hardiest weeds curled brown against the earth. The creek that once cut through Calder's pasture had shrunk to a trickle, its bed cracked and white. The cattle knew before men did, their ribs showing through their hides, their lowing desperate as they searched for water. Calder worked from dawn to dusk, digging trenches, hauling buckets, driving the herd farther and farther in search of grass. Evangeline did what she could, though every task left her body trembling. She mended clothes, baked bread, gathered what little wild green she could find near the dry creek bed. Each evening she waited with the baby on the porch, her eyes searching the horizon until Calder's silhouette finally appeared, horse-lathered and weary. Sometimes he came back empty-handed, only dust on his boots and sorrow in his eyes. One night, after another long day, she tried to hand him a bowl of stew she had scraped together from beans and dried venison. "It's not much," she said softly. Calder sat at the table, shoulders bowed, hands black with dirt from the well. He ate in silence, every bite slow, deliberate. When he finished, he pushed the empty bowl aside and said, "It's enough." The words struck her harder than any insult could have. Enough. No one had ever said that to her. That her effort, her meager offering, was not a failure but sufficient. She turned away quickly, blinking tears she would not let him see. But the drought was not the only shadow on the horizon. He came back into her life on a blazing afternoon. She had gone into town to trade for flour, the baby bundled close to her chest. She felt the stares as always, the muttered words, but she kept her eyes down. Then she heard a voice that froze her blood. "Evangeline." She turned. Jesse Rourke. Her husband. Though he'd abandoned that vow months ago when the whiskey and poker tables called louder. He stood with 2 drifters at his side, their faces sharp with hunger and cruelty. Jesse's once handsome features were bloated now, his beard ragged, but his eyes gleamed with that same mocking fire. "Well, I'll be damned," he drawled. "My wife, looking fat on another man's bread." The words made her stomach twist. She clutched the baby closer. "Stay away." But Jesse stepped closer, grinning. "That rancher's talking you in, ain't he? Word is his playing saint. But you're mine, Evangeline. Always were. Always will be." Calder's shadow fell across the street before Jesse could touch her. He said nothing, only stood, arms loose at his sides, his gaze locked on Rourke. The tension rippled like heat from the ground. Jesse's grin faltered, but only for a heartbeat. "This ain't finished," he spat, retreating with his men. "I'll come for what's mine." That night, Evangeline sat by the window long after the baby had fallen asleep, the lantern flickering shadows across her face. "He'll come back," she whispered. Calder sat at the table, cleaning his rifle with slow, steady motions. "Then we'll be ready." Her breath shook. "You don't understand. He's cruel. He'll burn the world just to see me crawl." Calder's eyes lifted, steady as always. "Then he'll learn some things don't burn so easy." The threat came sooner than expected. 3 nights later, the baby fell ill. Fever rose hot and fast, the little body writhing in Evangeline's arms. Terror gripped her so tight she could barely breathe. She soaked cloth in water, whispered prayers, but the fever raged on. Calder saddled his horse in the dead of night. "Medicine's in Red Bluff. I'll ride." "It's 20 miles, she said. He only nodded, swung into the saddle, and was gone into the darkness. Evangeline held her child through the endless hours, rocking, weeping, whispering songs half-remembered from her own mother's lips. The fever climbed, the tiny breaths shallow and weak. She thought her heart would break into dust before dawn. Then the door burst open. Calder staggered in, mud caked to his boots, his shirt torn. He carried a small bundle of herbs and powders, his face drawn and grey. He had walked the last miles, horse lamed by the rough trail. Without a word, he pressed the medicine into her hands. She brewed the bitter tea, forced drops between the baby's lips. Slowly, painfully, the child's breathing steadied. The fever broke as dawn bled pale light across the plains. Calder collapsed into the chair, head bowed, asleep before she could speak. Evangeline looked at him, his hands raw and bleeding, his body spent. For the first time, she reached out. She laid a blanket across his shoulders. Her hand lingered a moment on his arm, a touch not of fear, but of gratitude. The days that followed grew quieter, filled with small moments that stitched themselves into something like belonging. She learned to saddle a horse under his patient guidance, his hand steadying hers but never holding too long. She mended his shirt by lamplight, pricking her fingers, and he wore it the next day without comment, though she caught the faintest ghost of a smile when he saw her notice. At night, they sometimes sat on the porch in silence, the stars spread endless above. Once, she said softly, "I thought kindness was weakness." Calder's reply came after a long pause. "Kindness is the only thing that survives out here." But Jesse Rourke had not forgotten. The night it happened, the wind carried the smell before the flames. Evangeline rushed to the window, heart stopping at the sight. Calder's barn ablaze, fire licking high into the black sky. Cattle bawled in terror, stampeding through the night. The baby wailed in her arms. Smoke poured toward the house, choking. "Wyatt!" she cried. Calder was already in the yard, driving cattle away from the blaze, his figure black against the orange inferno. Sparks showered the ground. Then a beam cracked, the fire roaring louder. Smoke rolled toward the house. Evangeline clutched the baby, coughing, stumbling toward the door. Her legs faltered. The smoke blinded her. Strong arms swept her up, tearing her through the choking haze. Calder carried her clear, the baby pressed tight between them. His hands seared raw from the flames, but his grip never faltered. Behind them, the barn collapsed in a thunder of fire and ash. Evangeline turned in his arms, gasping, her face streaked with soot. "It was him," she choked. "Jesse, I know it." Calder's jaw tightened. He said nothing, but his silence was a vow. The ranch lay quiet after the fire, but the quiet was the kind that trembled with threat. The barn was gone, nothing left but a blackened skeleton, charred beams jutting like bones against the sky. Smoke clung to everything, the fields, the cattle, their very skin. Evangeline stood in the yard at dawn, baby pressed to her shoulder, staring at the ruin. Calder worked in silence, bandaged hands gripping the fence rail as he surveyed what could not be replaced. "This is my fault," she whispered. Calder's head turned slightly, but his eyes stayed on the horizon. "It's Rourke's fault." Her breath shook. "He'll come again." His silence was answer enough. The warning came 3 nights later. A rider pounded up the trail, hollering for Calder. Evangeline ran to the porch, clutching the baby close. The rider was an old neighbor, face pale with dust and fear. "Rourke's in town," he said. "Got 6 men drinking hard," bragged loud. "Says come sun up his tarkeen back what's his." Evangeline's knees weakened. Calder only nodded, the way a man nods when he's already decided the course. That night, he cleaned his rifle slow, steady, every motion precise. Evangeline watched him from the table, her hands twisted in her skirt. "You'll fight him?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'll protect what's mine," he said. The words struck her like a bell. What's mine? Not just land. Not just cattle. For the first time, she wondered if he meant her. Dawn rose red, the sky streaked like a wound. Rourke and his men rode in hard, dust trailing their horses like banners of war. They pulled up in front of the ranch, rifles gleaming, voices jeering. "Calder!" Rourke bellowed. "Come out and hand me what's mine, or I'll take it from the ashes of your house same as I took your barn." Evangeline stood just inside the door, the baby clutched tight, her heart hammering. She could see Calder through the window, striding into the yard with rifle in hand, his frame tall and unyielding. The 2 men faced each other across the dust. "You ain't got the men to stand against us," Rourke sneered. "You can't keep her. She's mine. Always was." Calder's reply was quiet, but it carried like a church bell through the morning air. "Not anymore." The first shot cracked, shattering the stillness. Chaos erupted. Rourke's men fired wild, bullets kicking up dirt around the porch. Calder dropped to one knee, firing back with the precision of a man who never wasted a bullet. One of Rourke's men fell, clutching his chest. Another fled, spooked horse carrying him off into the distance. Evangeline crouched inside, heart pounding, the baby crying in her arms. A shadow fell across the window, a man creeping toward the house, pistol raised. Terror surged, but so did something fiercer. She laid the baby in a basket, grabbed the shotgun Calder kept by the door, and stepped onto the porch. The man turned, surprise flashing across his face. Evangeline fired. The blast threw him back, dust rising around his body. Her hands shook, smoke curling from the barrel, but her eyes burned steady. For the first time in her life, she had not hidden. She had fought. The gunfight raged. One by one, Rourke's men fell or fled until only he remained, his grin gone, his face twisted with fury. He and Calder circled each other in the yard, rifles low now, pistols drawn. Dust swirled around their boots, the barn's black skeleton looming behind them like a gallows. "You think you can take her from me?" Rourke spat. "She's mine by law, by God, by." Calder's bullet tore his hat clean off, silencing him mid-word. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Then Rourke lunged, pistol raised. The crack of gunfire echoed across the valley. Rourke stumbled, weapon clattering from his hand. Calder stood firm, smoke curling from his pistol. He had shot to wound, not to kill. Rourke staggered backward, clutching his bleeding arm. His eyes blazed hate, but fear broke through at last. "This ain't over," he hissed. Calder leveled his gun, eyes cold. "It is." Rourke turned and fled, scrambling onto his horse, disappearing into the horizon with the last of the dust. Silence fell. Smoke drifted from the rifle barrels. The baby's cries carried across the yard. Evangeline stepped onto the porch, the shotgun still trembling in her hands. Calder lowered his pistol, breathing hard, blood seeping from a graze on his shoulder. Their eyes met across the wreckage. She dropped the gun, ran to him. With shaking hands she pressed cloth to his wound, her tears falling unchecked. "You saved us," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, you saved us." Her breath caught. She remembered the man creeping toward the house, the shotgun in her hands, the moment she chose to fight. She pressed her forehead to his chest, the bandage between them, the baby's cries softening as if even the child knew something had shifted. For a long time they stood there, nothing but the sound of their breaths and the settling dust. Weeks passed. The barn was rebuilt with the help of neighbors who, shamed by Calder's stand, finally came offering aid. Cattle returned to the pastures. Life crept back into the land. And then, one morning, the sky darkened with clouds not of smoke but of rain. Evangeline stood on the porch, baby in her arms, as the first drops fell. The dry earth drank greedily. Thunder rolled, not with fire this time, but with blessing. She looked toward the doorway. Calder stood there, watching the rain, the baby asleep against his shoulder. His hands, scarred and bandaged, cradled the child as gently as the day she first saw him in the town square. Evangeline's lips trembled, but not from fear. For the first time, she felt whole. She whispered, voice steady now, "We survived." Calder met her eyes, and though he said nothing, the faint curve of his mouth was answer enough. The rain poured harder, washing the ash from the land, leaving only the promise of green. Evangeline stood in the yard at dawn, baby pressed to her shoulder, staring at the ruin. Calder worked in silence, bandaged hands gripping the fence rail as he surveyed what could not be replaced. "This is my fault," she whispered. Calder's head turned slightly, but his eyes stayed on the horizon. "It's Rourke's fault." Her breath shook. "He'll come again." His silence was answer enough. The warning came 3 nights later. A rider pounded up the trail, hollering for Calder. Evangeline ran to the porch, clutching the baby close. The rider was an old neighbor, face pale with dust and fear. "Rourke's in town," he said. "Got 6 men drinking hard," bragged in loud. "Says come sun up his tarkeen back what's his." Evangeline's knees weakened. Calder only nodded, the way a man nods when he's already decided the course. That night, he cleaned his rifle slow, steady, every motion precise. Evangeline watched him from the table, her hands twisted in her skirt. "You'll fight him?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'll protect what's mine," he said. The words struck her like a bell. What's mine? Not just land. Not just cattle. For the first time, she wondered if he meant her. Dawn rose red, the sky streaked like a wound. Rourke and his men rode in hard, dust trailing their horses like banners of war. They pulled up in front of the ranch, rifles gleaming, voices jeering. "Calder!" Rourke bellowed. "Come out and hand me what's mine. Or I'll take it from the ashes of your house same as I took your barn." Evangeline stood just inside the door, the baby clutched tight, her heart hammering. She could see Calder through the window, striding into the yard with rifle in hand, his frame tall and unyielding. The two men faced each other across the dust. "You ain't got the men to stand against us," Rourke sneered. "You can't keep her. She's mine. Always was." Calder's reply was quiet, but it carried like a church bell through the morning air. "Not anymore." The first shot cracked, shattering the stillness. Chaos erupted. Rourke's men fired wild, bullets kicking up dirt around the porch. Calder dropped to one knee, firing back with the precision of a man who never wasted a bullet. One of Rourke's men fell, clutching his chest. Another fled, spooked horse carrying him off into the distance. Evangeline crouched inside, heart pounding, the baby crying in her arms. A shadow fell across the window, a man creeping toward the house, pistol raised. Terror surged, but so did something fiercer. She laid the baby in a basket, grabbed the shotgun Calder kept by the door, and stepped onto the porch. The man turned, surprise flashing across his face. Evangeline fired. The blast threw him back, dust rising around his body. Her hand shook, smoke curling from the barrel, but her eyes burned steady. For the first time in her life, she had not hidden. She had fought. The gunfight raged. One by one, Rourke's men fell or fled until only he remained, his grin gone, his face twisted with fury. He and Calder circled each other in the yard, rifles low now, pistols drawn. Dust swirled around their boots, the barn's black skeleton looming behind them like a gallows. "You think you can take her from me?" Rourke spat. "She's mine by law, by God, by..." Calder's bullet tore his hat clean off, silencing him mid-word. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Then Rourke lunged, pistol raised. The crack of gunfire echoed across the valley. Rourke stumbled, weapon clattering from his hand. Calder stood firm, smoke curling from his pistol. He had shot to wound, not to kill.